Just curious. What device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
During Christmas dinner, right as I passed the mashed potatoes and tried to smile through the usual forced holiday cheer, my dad looked me dead in the eye and said it. Not a whisper, not a mutter, but with the kind of steel-cut certainty that could slice bone. "You're a burden, Julia, and you can't stay with us anymore." The room didn't go silent. It stayed horribly, unnaturally normal. The clinking of cutlery, the soft Christmas jazz humming in the background, my brother Ethan chuckling about some story he was telling right before the bomb dropped. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, spoon midair, staring at the man who once taught me how to ride a bike, who once kissed my scraped knee in the driveway when I fell. I looked at my mother, hoping, maybe foolishly, for a sign of disapproval or shock, or at least some kind of subtle rebellion in her expression. But instead she dropped her eyes to her plate, stirred the gravy on her potatoes, and said nothing. The turkey was perfectly roasted, stuffed just the way my mom always made it, with that sage and sausage mixture that used to make me feel like home. Except that night, it tasted like sawdust. I chewed slowly, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. My whole body tensed, but I held my tongue, and while part of me wanted to flip the table and storm out like a dramatic scene from a bad TV movie, I didn't. Not yet. It was Ethan who broke the silence next, smirking like he'd just watched a bad sitcom punchline land. "Well, guess we're finally saying the quiet part out loud," he said, taking a long drink of his wine. I turned toward him, stared at the 35-year-old man-child who still lived with our parents, who hadn't held a full-time job since college, and I thought, really thought, about whether I should open my mouth and lay it all out, but not yet. It wasn't time. Instead, I smiled, forced and tight, and said, "Sure, Dad, let's talk about burdens." But he wasn't interested in conversation. Richard Davis had already delivered his verdict. He went back to cutting his turkey like he hadn't just eviscerated his only daughter at his Christmas table. The rest of dinner went on with awkward stabs at small talk. Marilyn nervously offering more wine, Ethan talking about his new business venture, and me sitting there with a storm in my chest, smiling, nodding, responding politely, and slowly deciding that this was the last time I'd ever sit at that table as a daughter. The thing is, they didn't know. That's what made it all the more bitter. For the last 5 years, I'd been quietly paying their mortgage, not because they asked. They never would. But because I saw the unpaid bills stacked in the kitchen drawer, I noticed when the heating oil was late, when the credit card statements started to go unopened, and I thought I was doing the right thing. I told myself I was keeping the family afloat, that I was doing my part because they'd done theirs when I was a kid, even if it wasn't perfect. I paid the electric, the property taxes, the damn Netflix subscription, and all without a word. I never told them. I didn't want the praise, just the peace. But here I was getting served a slice of humble pie between the mashed potatoes and the green bean casserole. After dinner, I went upstairs to the guest room, not my room anymore, apparently, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the framed photo of us from Christmas 1998. I was in high school, wearing that awful red sweater Marilyn made me wear, holding a present I pretended to like. Dad was smiling, hand on my shoulder, proud like he had something to show off. I took the frame off the dresser, turned it over, and noticed for the first time that the back was cracked, like someone had dropped it and never bothered to fix it. Just like us, I thought. I couldn't sleep. I laid awake listening to the creaks of the old house, the soft ticking of the heating pipes, and Marilyn moving around downstairs long after midnight. I wondered what she was thinking, if she regretted not saying anything, if she even noticed how much I'd done. Probably not. People see what they want, and they'd convince themselves I was just some failed woman who couldn't keep a marriage and came crawling home with her tail between her legs. They had no idea that my condo in Boston was fully paid off, that I'd built a 6-figure marketing career from scratch, that I wasn't there out of necessity. I was there because I thought maybe, just maybe, we could still be a family. The next morning, I made coffee, black, no sugar, no cream, just like Dad liked it. I set the mug on the table without saying a word and started cooking breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel their eyes following me, confused, cautious. And in that moment, something in me settled. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the burning kind of angry anyway. I was ready. By the time Ethan rolled in wearing his hoodie and pajama pants, I was already packing my things upstairs. No fight, no farewell speeches, just quiet, deliberate packing. Every sweater, every sock, every reminder that I'd once called this place home. They didn't come up, not even once. Not until I zipped the last bag, dragged it down the stairs, and paused in the doorway. And that's when I made the decision. Not to scream or cry, but to show them the truth the only way I knew they'd feel it. But that's the thing about people like them. They don't realize you've been carrying them until you let go. And when I let go the next day, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, clean, cold, and it hit hard. Hard enough that my dad would literally drop his fork in the middle of breakfast. The night after the Christmas dinner disaster, when I lay awake in the guest room, my stomach a knot of emotions I couldn't quite name, some mixture of rage, sorrow, and a strange kind of freedom. I kept running through every interaction we'd had over the years, flipping through memories like dusty old VHS tapes, trying to pinpoint when exactly the switch had flipped, when I'd stopped being a daughter and started being a utility, a silent ATM with a forced smile, nodding politely while my father talked over me and my mother covered her discomfort with fake politeness and too many napkins folded into swans. The words, "You're a burden," had been floating on repeat in my head all night. But what gnawed at me more than the insult was the fact that none of them, not Richard, not Marilyn, and certainly not Ethan, had even thought to question whether I was the one who needed help. Or if maybe, just maybe, they were the ones leaning on me more than they'd ever admit. By morning, I was exhausted, but too wired to rest. So I got dressed in silence, grabbed a cup of bitter black coffee from the kitchen, and descended into the cellar, where I knew Marilyn kept all the household documents. The kind of records she didn't want anyone else to see, hidden behind old Christmas decorations and boxes labeled taxes in her careful, curling script. The cellar had that familiar smell of damp wood and forgotten years, and as I opened the cabinet under the stairs, I found the old plastic filing bin I remembered from high school, the one she'd once used to keep report cards and utility bills side by side like they meant the same thing. I sat on the concrete floor, legs crossed like I used to as a kid when I read under the dinner table, and I pulled out binder after binder, flipping through yellowed receipts, outdated bank statements, and what I eventually found to be a quiet, undeniable record of my contributions. There, buried among the cobwebs and dust, were copies of wire transfers, statements with my name on the payer line, letters from the bank confirming payments received. Month after month, year after year, some still had my post-it notes attached, scribbled reminders like covered until March or mortgage late fee waived. And as I sat there, staring at tangible proof of every dollar I'd poured into this house, I felt an emotion rise in me that I hadn't expected. Contempt, not just for them, but for myself. For letting it go on so long, for trying so hard to earn love through money, as if saving the roof over their heads would somehow rebuild the bridge that had collapsed so long ago. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of dishes clinking and Marilyn humming Christmas carols under her breath, like the world was still spinning on its proper axis, as if her daughter hadn't just been disowned with cranberry sauce still on her plate. I stood up slowly, legs stiff, and put the binders back exactly as I found them, but not before taking a few photocopies with me. Proof, not just for them, but for me, that I hadn't imagined it all, that I hadn't dreamed the years of silent support, of quiet sacrifice. I wasn't crazy. I was just done pretending this was love. Later that afternoon, as I walked down the hallway past my parents' room, I overheard Marilyn speaking softly to Ethan. Her voice hushed, but not quite low enough to mask the bitterness bleeding through. She should be grateful we took her in after everything. Lord knows Richard didn't want to, but we did it anyway. She's lucky we're so forgiving. I paused, holding my breath, trying to process what exactly she meant by after everything. What had I done, other than try to hold this God-forsaken family together? What forgiveness did I owe them? I waited a moment, then kept walking, letting the bitterness calcify into something sharper, something useful. That evening, I made a decision that had been building for years, but had finally come into full focus. I walked to my room, opened my laptop, logged into every account tied to the Davis household: mortgage, utilities, streaming services, grocery deliveries, and one by one, I removed my payment information, canceled auto payments, shut down subscriptions. It took less than 10 minutes. That's the thing about levers of power. You don't always realize you're holding them until you decide to let go. I didn't announce it. I didn't storm into the living room with a monologue. I simply made the changes and went on packing my bags. This time slower, more methodically, folding each sweater like I was folding away years of self-betrayal. Every item I placed in my suitcase felt like another piece of myself I was reclaiming from their emotional overdraft. But here's the twist, and this part will sit with me for the rest of my life. I still wanted to believe that maybe, in some strange, miraculous way, they'd see the truth and say, "We were wrong." Not for me, but for the years I spent begging myself to believe that loyalty still meant something in this family. I still hoped, foolishly maybe, that when they saw what I'd done, they'd feel shame, or gratitude, or at the very least, confusion. As I zipped the final suitcase and set it by the door, the air in the house shifted. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was real, but I swear the walls felt colder, the floor less steady, the foundation cracking not from age or wear, but from the sudden absence of my silent contributions. They didn't know yet, but they would. Tomorrow morning, over breakfast, I'd drop the final pebble into their perfect little glass of denial, and I'd watch the ripples reach the edges. And maybe, just maybe, they'd finally taste the truth. And it wouldn't be sweet. The morning sun filtered through the brittle lace curtains like it always had, casting pale shadows across the chipped linoleum of the kitchen floor, but the warmth it once promised seemed to bypass that house entirely, as if it knew better than to linger in a place where affection had long since withered into obligation and routine. I stood by the stove, carefully flipping bacon in the old cast-iron skillet that had probably outlived every good intention in this house, listening to the rhythmic sizzle and letting the noise drown out the silence of a family that had become a transaction, a performance of manners masking a festering undercurrent of resentment that no one wanted to name. The coffee maker sputtered and hissed beside me, and I poured 3 mugs, black, no sugar, just the way Richard liked it, just the way I had served it every morning during my visit. Like clockwork, even though by then I had already decided this would be the last time. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, the sound of a man who had grown too comfortable being waited on, too confident that his role as the patriarch granted him immunity from consequences. My mother followed shortly after, slippers scuffing softly against the hardwood, her presence as unobtrusive as ever, always careful not to make waves even as the boat sank around her. Ethan, of course, emerged last, yawning theatrically, scratching his chest beneath his worn hoodie, and mumbling something about how he hadn't slept well, as if that, too, was somehow someone else's fault. They each took their seats around the table without much fanfare, the way they always had, Richard at the head, Marilyn to his right, Ethan across from me, like some twisted Norman Rockwell painting where everyone knew their place, but had long since forgotten why it mattered. I placed the plates down one by one, eggs, toast, bacon, then returned to the counter, taking a long sip of my own coffee and savoring the moment. The calm before the revelation, the final breath before the truth hit like a punch to the chest. I waited until the first bites were taken, until the room settled into that familiar rhythm of idle chatter and the occasional scrape of fork against porcelain, and then, with the most casual tone I could muster, I said, "By the way, I went ahead and stopped covering your bills. Figured it wasn't right to keep being a burden." For a second, no one reacted, as if my words hadn't fully registered, as if the weight of what I said hadn't yet settled into the fabric of their carefully maintained delusions. But then Richard froze mid-chew, fork raised halfway to his mouth, and in that suspended moment, I saw it. The dawning comprehension, the flicker of panic behind his eyes, the sudden awareness that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as he'd believed. The fork clattered to the plate, a sharp metallic clang that seemed to slice through the air louder than it had any right to, and he stared at me, his face blank. Caught between disbelief and fury, Marilyn gasped softly, hand flying to her chest in reflex, as though she'd just witnessed a car crash or a sudden death, and she turned to me with wide, searching eyes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, struggling to find the right words but too late to stop the bleeding. Ethan blinked, confused. His fork paused in the air like he was waiting for someone to explain the joke, because surely this had to be a joke, right? Julia, the reliable one, the background noise, the dependable older sister who always handled everything. She wouldn't just pull the plug without warning. But I didn't smile, I didn't explain. I simply took another sip of coffee, turned toward the window, and let the silence swell. What do you mean? Richard finally asked, his voice a brittle echo of the authority he used to command, the kind of tone that had once made me flinch, but now only reminded me how hollow his power truly was. What bills? I turned back to face him, leveling my gaze like I was staring down a man I'd finally seen for who he really was, and replied evenly, the mortgage, the electric, the water, the insurance, Netflix too, though I'm sure Ethan will miss that most. Ethan scoffed, still not fully connecting the dots. Wait, you were paying the mortgage? Since when? 5 years, I said, placing my mug gently on the counter. Give or take a few months. Started when Dad missed 2 payments and nearly lost the house. I stepped in, quietly, figured it was what family did, but apparently I've overstayed my welcome. The room fell into a kind of stunned paralysis, each of them processing what that meant in their own flawed way. Richard looked like he'd been sucker punched, his face paling beneath the overhead light, hands trembling just slightly as he picked up the fallen fork and set it down again, like he needed something, anything, to do with his hands. Marilyn was already tearing up, her fingers trembling as she reached for a napkin, dabbing at the corners of her eyes like she could somehow wipe away the years of silence, of complicity. And Ethan, God, Ethan just looked lost, like someone had dropped him into a foreign country where he didn't speak the language and suddenly expected him to survive. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't soften the blow. Because this wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. It was about clarity, about finally stripping away the performance and showing them the mirror they had refused to look into. I grabbed my keys from the counter, hoisted the suitcase I'd packed the night before, and without another word, I walked to the front door. But before I left, I placed a thick manila envelope on the table beside my father's coffee mug. An envelope filled with copies of every payment receipt, every wire transfer, every bank statement marked paid by J. Davis, a ledger of 5 years' worth of sacrifice they had conveniently never noticed. I didn't need them to thank me. I didn't even need them to understand. I just needed them to see, really see. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cold December air hit me like a slap, crisp and honest. And for the first time in years, I felt lighter, not because the weight had vanished, but because I'd finally decided it wasn't mine to carry anymore. And behind me, through the closed door, I imagined them still sitting there, staring at that envelope, the realization sinking in inch by inch, and maybe, just maybe, beginning to understand what it really means to call someone a burden. 1 week passed like the slow, dull ache beneath the skin, persistent, unignorable, and yet not sharp enough to command attention every moment, but always there, pressing at the edges of everything I tried to do. I returned to my apartment in Boston, where the windows faced out toward the city skyline, and the streets below still buzzed with late December shoppers and bundled up children dragging parents toward whatever store had caught their attention. The world moved on with a kind of cruel indifference, spinning forward as though nothing significant had happened, as though my family hadn't imploded over mashed potatoes and coffee. My condo, clean and silent, felt like a cathedral compared to the suffocating weight of the Davis household. And yet, as I moved from room to room unpacking, trying to slide back into the comfortable rhythm of my life, I found myself haunted by the quiet echoes of things never said, by the ghosts of conversations that had always stayed stuck, somewhere between my chest and my throat. I hadn't heard from them, not one word. No calls, no texts, no panicked voicemails demanding answers. At first, I assumed they were still in shock, maybe stewing in embarrassment or denial. But eventually, I began to wonder if they had already rewritten the narrative in their heads, casting me as the ungrateful daughter, the dramatic one, the outsider who always thought she was better than them. I knew how they operated, how easily they could convince themselves that silence was strength and that not reacting was the high road. But what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to understand, was that I had spent years living in that silence, sitting with my feelings like they were uninvited house guests I could never quite ask to leave. And so one night, curled up on my couch with a glass of red wine and the city lights flickering outside, I opened an old wooden box I hadn't touched in years, tucked away on the top shelf of my closet, filled with a collection of letters I had written over the course of my adult life. Letters addressed to no one and everyone, mostly to my parents, sometimes to Ethan, a few to the version of myself that still believed family meant something sacred and unbreakable. They were handwritten in different pens, on mismatched paper, napkins, old journals, the back of utility bills, and none of them had ever been sent. They were too honest, too raw, filled with truths I had never had the courage to say out loud. One letter, dated 3 years ago, began with, "Dear Dad, I know you love Ethan more than me. You've never said it, and maybe you'd deny it even if I asked you directly, but I see it in the way your voice softens when he speaks, the way your disappointment in him always comes wrapped in excuses, while your expectations of me feel like a list of unpayable debts." Another, to Marilyn, simply said, "Mom, you always say you don't want to choose sides, but neutrality in the face of cruelty isn't wisdom. It's betrayal, no matter how softly you deliver it." There were dozens of them, little explosions of feeling, bottled and buried, written late at night in the quiet hours when my defenses were down and the ache of being invisible became too much to hold. I read each one slowly, reliving the anger, the heartbreak, the tiny moments that had cut deeper than they should have. A missed birthday, a passive-aggressive comment at Thanksgiving, a look exchanged between my parents when I mentioned a promotion, as if my success was some kind of personal offense. These weren't just memories. They were data points, proof of a pattern that had started long before I ever offered to help with the bills, before I'd ever stepped in to save the house from foreclosure. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about value, about what I had been worth to them when I had nothing to give versus when I gave too much. Then, as I sat there with the stack of letters in my lap, my phone buzzed. A single message from Ethan. No greeting, no apology, just, "Dad's sick. Something with his heart. They might lose the house. Can you help?" I stared at the screen for a long time, stunned not by the content of the message, but by the audacity of it. The casual expectation, the complete lack of context or humility, the assumption that I would just step in again because that's what I'd always done. There was no acknowledgement of the dinner, no mention of the words Richard had said, no trace of remorse, just need, raw and ugly. I thought about replying. I even typed out a few drafts. One was cold and businesslike. "I suggest you speak to a financial advisor." Another was biting. "Tell him to sell the TV, he used to ignore me all these years." But none of it felt right. None of it would make them understand. Words weren't the answer anymore. Instead, I did something else. I opened my laptop and pulled up the mortgage account again. Though I'd removed my payment method, I still had access to the portal. I clicked through the overdue notices, the rising interest, the penalty fees, stacking like bricks in a wall they'd built themselves. And then I wrote a short email, not to Ethan, not to my parents, but to the bank, officially terminating my involvement as guarantor on their mortgage, a technicality I'd agreed to long ago in a moment of misguided compassion. The message was simple, professional, and final. I signed it, closed the laptop, and returned to my wine. There would be no letter sent, no explanation, no comfort. They would face the consequences on their own this time, not because I hated them, but because I finally loved myself enough to walk away. And that, I realized, was the most painful revenge of all. Not rage, not retaliation, just absence. It was a Wednesday morning, nearly a month after I walked out of that house, the same one that had once held every Christmas of my childhood, where stockings were hung on a crooked mantle with dollar store tinsel, where the smell of cinnamon rolls and my mother's nutmeg-heavy coffee filled the air long before the sun rose on Christmas Day. And yet now, standing on the sidewalk just across the street, staring at that familiar brick facade and the cracked shutters that had never been replaced, I realized I couldn't quite remember the last time that place had felt like home, if it ever truly had. The house looked smaller somehow, though I knew it hadn't changed. Its dimensions hadn't shrunk, but the illusion of its permanence had been shattered, and all that was left was an aging shell, a structure that had clung to warmth only so long as I had kept fueling the fire. The yard, which Richard used to obsess over like a sacred duty, was overgrown, the grass now brittle and yellowed in patches, with weeds sprouting along the walkway like nature had decided to reclaim what negligence had invited. The porch light was out, the blinds in the front window were tilted awkwardly, and the American flag that once hung proudly from the post near the door now drooped half-detached, tattered at the edges like it had given up the fight. It wasn't derelict yet, but it was no longer held together by pride or love or habit. It was simply deteriorating, the way all things do when no one shows up to keep them alive. I didn't walk up to the house. I didn't ring the doorbell or peek inside. I just stood there, long enough to confirm what I already suspected. They were gone. Maybe not for good, maybe not forever, but in a way that mattered. The mailbox was stuffed with circulars and unopened mail, and the driveway was empty, the oil stain from Richard's truck still visible like a scar. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the spare key, still attached to the little Red Sox keychain I'd put on it when I was 25, back when I thought belonging somewhere was a matter of proximity. And I walked across the street, slipped the key into the mailbox, and let it go without ceremony. I didn't want to know where they had gone, whether they were staying with Marilyn's sister in Connecticut or holed up in some extended stay motel along the highway, trying to stretch what little money they had left. I didn't want to know if Richard was recovering or declining or still furious at me in the same way he had always been whenever I stepped outside the lines he had drawn around what a daughter should be. I didn't need answers. Not anymore. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, a glass of bourbon in hand and the Christmas tree twinkling softly in the corner. Not the grand fir we used to drag home on cold December mornings, but a modest pre-lit artificial one that I'd picked up on sale and decorated with a few handmade ornaments I'd kept over the years. Ones that held memories not of family unity, but of quiet rebellion. The crooked gingerbread man I made in 5th grade, the porcelain angel I bought for myself the year no one else thought to get me a gift, the blue bauble I stole from Ethan's box the year he called me selfish. They weren't reminders of love, they were artifacts of survival. I cooked a small dinner for myself. Roasted vegetables, a simple chicken breast, and a bottle of wine that had been sitting on the shelf for far too long. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to a jazz playlist that reminded me of late nights in college, when the world still felt open and unwritten. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel that familiar ache of being alone on Christmas, because solitude, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as loneliness. In fact, for someone who had spent decades surrounded by people who claimed to love her while simultaneously draining her dry, this kind of aloneness felt like breathing after years underwater. Later that night, I called my Aunt Lydia, not because I needed an update, but because I knew she'd give me one whether I wanted it or not. She answered on the second ring, cheerful as ever, clearly already a few drinks into her holiday. "Julia, Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Are you okay?" Her voice was warm, and for once I didn't brace myself for judgment. We talked for a while, about trivial things mostly, until she finally got around to what she clearly had wanted to say all along. "So your mom's with me now," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "Richard, well, he's in rehab. Heart thing, plus they're saying stress. Ethan's crashing on a buddy's couch for now. The house, well, it's probably going to auction next month." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and took another sip of my drink. "Okay," I said softly. "That makes sense." "You know they're not doing great," she added, hesitation creeping into her voice. "But Marilyn's, she keeps saying she hopes you'll call, even if it's just once." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch between us, not because I was being cruel, but because I needed her to understand that a call is not a cure, that forgiveness is not something that can be summoned on demand, like a phone number or a bank transfer. "I might send a card," I said finally, the words slipping out like an afterthought. "That would mean a lot," she said. "Maybe one of those glittery ones with fake snow," I added, staring at the lights on my little tree, but no return address. After we hung up, I sat back and looked around the apartment. The soft hum of the heater, the flickering candle on the windowsill, the stack of unread books I finally had time to open, and I realized that despite the wreckage I'd left behind, despite the silence and the absence and the grief, I felt whole, not healed, not fixed, but whole, in the sense that I had finally drawn a boundary and stood behind it without flinching. They would survive, or they wouldn't. They would learn, or they wouldn't. And me, I would wake up tomorrow and the day after that, and the one after that, not waiting for permission to feel worthy, because I had already given that permission to myself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real inheritance I had been fighting for all along.